The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. In a distant land there lived a king and queen who could have no children. Nothing else would give them pleasure, and they moved through their days as if they were in mourning. But after many years, the queen at last bore a daughter. The christening was magnificent. For the child's godmothers, 7 fairies were chosen. Each was to give a gift, a talent, or a virtue that would make the child perfection itself. After the christening, the company returned to the palace, where a great feast had been prepared to honor the 7 fairies. Before each one was a golden plate with a knife and forks and spoon set with diamonds and rubies. But just as they were sitting down to eat, a very old fairy came into the hall. She had not been invited because she had to shut herself in a high, distant tower for many years, and it was thought that she was dead. The king ordered a place laid for the old fairy, but he could not give her a golden plate with a knife and fork and a spoon as the others had, for only 7 had been made. The old fairy was outraged and muttered threats beneath her breath. A young fairy sat nearby and heard her. Fearing that the uninvited one might harm the little princess, she hid herself in the curtains. She wanted to give the last gift of all, and in this way, perhaps undo any evil that the old fairy was planning. Soon it was time to give gifts to the princess. The youngest fairy said she would grow up to be beautiful. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third promised her grace. The fourth gave her a gift of dancing. The fifth gave her a gift of singing. And the last fairy said she would be able to play sweet music on any instrument she took up. Now it was the old fairy's turn. She came up near the cradle, her head shaking with rage and spite. The young princess's beauty and accomplishments will not help her, she announced. For one day she will prick her hand on a tiny spindle, and when this happens, she will die. The terrible gift made all company tremble and weep, and the old queen could not be confronted. But at this instant the young fairy who had hidden came from behind in the curtains and cried out, "No, my king and queen, your child will not die from this wound. It is true I have not the power to change an older fairy's gift. The princess will indeed pierce her fingers with the spindle, but instead of dying she will only fall into a deep sleep. It will last 100 years, and at the end of it the king's son will come and awaken her." The young fairy's words were scant of comfort. To avoid the misfortune she had been foretold for his daughter, the king ordered all the spindles in the kingdom to be destroyed. Anyone even found spinning was to be put to death. 15 or 16 years afterward, the king and queen were away in the countryside, and a young princess was running around in the palace. She went from room to room and came at last into a little garret on top of the tower. There was an old woman spinning with her spindle. The old woman never heard of the king's orders, so she had gone into making her thread in the way of her mother and grandmother before her. "What are you doing, my good woman?" asked the princess. "I am spinning, pretty child," she said the old woman, for she did not know who the princess was. "How clever," said the princess. "How do you do it? Give it to me so I can try." Either because she was careless or because the old fairy had ordered it, no sooner had the girl taken the spindle that pierced her hand and she fell down into a swoon. A good old woman cried out for help. Servants and courtiers and ladies came running from every room in the palace. They threw water on the princess's face. They unlaced her and struck her on the palms of her hands and rubbed her temples with cologne. But it was no use. Nothing would awaken her. Then the king, who had returned from the countryside, saw that the old fairy's cruel gift had come to pass, and the daughter must sleep for 100 years. By this order she was carried into the finest room in the palace and laid upon a bed embroidered with silver and gold. The color in her face was undimmed, and she was beautiful as ever. It is true that her eyes were shut, but those who listened closely could hear her breathe, so they knew she was not dead. The young fairy who had saved the princess's life was far away in the kingdom of Mactan, but a dwarf in 7 league boots came there to give her the news. At once the fairy left the palace in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king greeted her gently and showed her the room where the princess slept. Though the fairy saw she was well provided for, she thought how sad the princess would be if she woke up alone in a great palace with the people she knew dead and gone. She touched everyone with her magic ring. She touched the housekeepers, maids in waiting and quarters, the cooks, the scullions, and the footmen. And then she went into the stable and touched the horses and the stable boys. She even touched Puff, the princess's little dog, who was curled up on the bed beside her. At once they all fell fast asleep and would not wake until the princess woke. Everything in the palace was motionless. The spits on the fire with their partridge meats and pheasants stopped turning. The flames died down and slept. The king and queen watched the fairy in silence, and then she was done. They kissed their beloved daughter goodbye and left the palace forever. Within a quarter of an hour, a great number of trees interlaced with brambles and thorns grew up around the park and formed a hedge so thick neither man nor beast could penetrate it, and it was so tall only the tallest turrets of the palace could be seen. In this way, the fairy made a magical safe place where the princess can sleep in peace. At the end of 100 years, the son of a king who lived nearby went hunting in the countryside. He asked the people about the turrets he saw in the woods and why the hedge grew there so thickly. Each told him a different story. Some said it was a place full of ghosts, and others said witches went there to hold their Sabbath meetings. Still others said it was home of an ogre who caught children and ate them alive. The prince did not know what to believe. Then a very old man said to him, "Please, your highness, more than 50 years past, I hear my father say there was once at a time in this castle a princess, the most beautiful ever seen. Because she was bewitched, she must sleep for 100 years and could be awakened only by a prince." Never had the king's son heard such a marvelous adventure. Fired by love and desire for glory, he resolved at once to gain entry to the palace. He prepared to cut down the edge with his sword. But as soon as he came there, all the great trees and bushes, the brambles parted to let him pass through. He came out upon a broad avenue, and at the end of it was the palace. But when he looked behind to see if his servants were still with him, he discovered that the hedge had closed again, and he was all alone. However, this did not deter him, for he was a young prince in search of love and glory. Quickly he walked into the palace courtyard, but what he saw made him stop in amazement. Frightful silence hung over the place, and the image of death was everywhere. A score of men were outstretched upon the paving stones, their limbs like grostwick eagles. But the prince saw, beside the porters and goblets still filled with wine. He leaned down next to them and felt the movement of their chests. He knew they were alive and had fallen asleep while drinking their wine. Next he crossed a court paved with marble and came into the guard-room. Guards were standing in their ranks with their muskets on their shoulders, snoring with all their might. He went upstairs through several rooms with people, men and women both, were standing, and others were sitting, but all were sleeping soundly. Finally he entered a gilded chamber where he saw upon a bed embroidered with gold and silver, a girl 15 or 16 years. Her coral lips were parted slightly, and her beauty was luminous that she seemed almost to shine. The prince approached her, trembling upon his knees. Then at the end of the enchantment had to come, the princess awoke. She gazed at the king's son tenderly, as if she already knew him. "Is it you, my prince?" she said at last. You have waited a long time." The prince was thrilled by her words and told her He loved her better than he did himself. They spoke for many hours, and though their conversation made little sense or hardly mattered, the princess laughed merely and nodded the prince's remarks. It was almost as if she imagined the moment of her awakening many times over, and she knew what he would say. Perhaps the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very pleasant dreams. In the meantime, all the palace had woken with the princess, and they were naturally concerned with their own needs. Since they were not in love, they were ready to keel over with hunger. The lady of honor at last lost patience and told the princess that dinner must be served. At at this, the prince helped her up from the bed. Her clothing was magnificent, but he took care not to tell her she was just like his grandmother. They went together into a great mirrored hall, where they ate their meals to an old-fashioned melodies of violins, elbows, and had been silent for 100 years. After the supper, Chapin married them into the palace chapel without losing any time. That night they slept a little. As the princess was so well rested, they had still much to say. And in the morning, as dawn was breaking, they traveled to the princess's city, where their parents eagerly awaited them.